Love doesn't die in a single moment. The refrigerator hums in the same key it always has. The clock above the stove still blinks 12 and walk because neither of us ever learned how to reset it. There's coffee in the pot from this morning, gone cold and bitter, and Marcus's jacket hangs on the same hook by the door where he's left it every evening for 8 years. Everything looks exactly as it should. That's what made it so easy to miss. How quietly the ground beneath us had been eroding, one conversation at a time. This isn't fiction. This is how love disappears, one borrowed word at a time. Friday afternoons belonged to Claire and me. They had for nearly 3 years, ever since we'd discovered we both took late lunches and lived close enough to the same downtown cafe that meeting there felt inevitable rather than planned. We'd sit at the corner table near the window, the one that caught afternoon light in a way that made everything feel softer, more forgivable. She always ordered the same thing: black coffee and whatever pastry looked least like something her nutritionist would approve of. I usually got tea, though I never finished it. The cafe itself was unremarkable. Exposed brick, Edison bulbs, the kind of studied casualness that Brooklyn perfected and every other city copied. But it was ours in the way that spaces become meaningful through repetition. The barista knew our orders. The other regulars nodded in recognition. It was a pocket of the world where we could be honest without consequence, or so I thought. We talked about everything: her marriage to David, which she described with a fondness that felt both genuine and resigned, the way you might speak about a favorite sweater that no longer fit quite right, but you couldn't bring yourself to donate. My marriage to Marcus, which I spoke about less, though she never pressed. We talked about our mothers, our jobs, our bodies as they changed in ways we hadn't anticipated. We talked about desire and disappointment, about the gap between the life you imagine at 25 and the one you're living at 38. Claire had this gift for articulation that I envied. She could take a feeling I'd been carrying around like loose change in my pocket, something I knew was there but couldn't quite describe, and give it shape, weight, language. She made the unspeakable speakable. She made loneliness sound less like failure and more like a universal condition we were all trying to navigate with varying degrees of grace. She had a way of naming things I'd felt but never articulated. Once, while discussing why she'd stopped initiating sex with David, she said, "It's not that I don't want him. It's that I don't want to want him anymore. Does that make sense?" It did, completely. She described desire as this exhausting obligation, this thing you were supposed to maintain like a garden or a checking account, and how sometimes you just wanted to let it go fallow for a while without being made to feel like you were failing at being a wife. I didn't know then that Marcus was listening too. Not to her, but to me talking about her. Not directly, but through a chain of translation I wouldn't understand until much later. The house smelled like garlic and rosemary the first time I noticed. Marcus had made dinner, chicken with roasted vegetables, something he did once or twice a month, when work wasn't consuming him entirely. We ate at the table instead of in front of the television, which felt both formal and strangely intimate. He asked about my day. I told him about a difficult client, about traffic on the bridge, about nothing that mattered. The kitchen was warm in that particular way it gets when the oven's been on for hours. Steam had fogged the window above the sink. Outside, the neighbor's porch light was already on, even though it was barely 6. Winter was coming early that year. Then, while clearing plates, he said something that made me pause mid-reach for my water glass. "Maybe we've stopped trying to want each other." I looked at him. His back was to me, hands busy at the sink, shoulders set in that particular way he held himself when he was attempting casualness. The words hung in the air between us like smoke. They sounded rehearsed, or at least considered, the kind of thing you'd thought about before saying aloud. "What do you mean?" I asked. He turned, drying his hands on a towel, and there was something in his expression I couldn't quite name. Vulnerability, maybe, or rehearsal. "I mean, sometimes I think we've gotten so used to each other that we've forgotten how to actually want each other. Not just go through the motions, but really want." They were almost exactly the words Claire had used. Not quite. He'd changed "don't want" to stopped trying to want, but close enough that something cold moved through my chest. The phrasing was too specific, too close to a conversation I'd had 3 days earlier over lukewarm tea and a blueberry scone I'd picked apart but not eaten. I told myself I was being paranoid. People use similar phrases all the time. Desire and routine and marriage were universal topics. Of course, the language around them would overlap. How many ways were there, really, to describe the slow erosion of passion in a long-term relationship? The well had to run dry, eventually. Everyone borrowed from the same vocabulary. Maybe, I said, and the conversation moved elsewhere. To his mother's upcoming birthday, to whether we needed to replace the furnace filter, to the ordinary logistics of a shared life. But I remembered the precise angle of light through the kitchen window, the way the soap bubbles caught it, how my heartbeat had briefly stuttered, then resumed its normal rhythm, slightly faster than before. That night, I lay in bed listening to Marcus breathe beside me and catalog the conversation. The exact words, the cadence, the way he delivered them, like he was trying on a new shirt to see if it fit. And I thought about Claire saying those words to me, about how I'd nodded and understood completely, about how I'd probably said something equally honest back, about how none of it had been secret exactly, but it had been ours. Private, in the way that conversations between women often are, not hidden, but separate from the men in our lives. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but I also didn't sleep particularly well. The following Friday, Claire and I met at our usual table. She was already there when I arrived, scrolling through her phone with that particular intensity that meant she was avoiding something. Her coffee sat untouched beside her, still steaming. She looked up when I sat down, and her smile was tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. David and I had a fight, she said without preamble. Or not even a fight, just one of those conversations where you both say what you mean and somehow that makes it worse. I stirred sugar into my tea, even though I never took sugar. It gave my hands something to do. What happened? She picked at the edge of her napkin, tearing small strips and rolling them into tiny pills. I told him I felt like we were just performing marriage instead of living it, like we'd both memorized our parts so well that we didn't need to actually feel anything anymore. We could just execute the routine. What did he say? She laughed without humor, a sound that was more air than voice. He said I was always better with words than feelings, that I could describe problems beautifully, but I couldn't fix them. That's cruel. Maybe. Or maybe it's true. She looked out the window at the street, at people passing with their Friday afternoon purposes. Dry cleaning slung over shoulders, grocery bags cutting lines into palms, everyone moving through their lives with apparent direction. I don't know anymore. When did everything get so complicated? We used to just be. Now everything requires translation. Like we're speaking different languages and we're both too tired to keep interpreting for each other. I knew exactly what she meant. There was a kind of exhaustion that came with long-term relationships that no one warned you about. Not the dramatic kind, not the fighting or the betrayal, but the slow, grinding tiredness of constantly having to explain yourself to someone who should, theoretically, already understand you. We talked for an hour about performance and authenticity, about how intimacy can become a kind of choreography you execute perfectly while feeling nothing, about the way marriage asks you to be both completely known and perpetually interesting, and how exhausting that paradox becomes. You're supposed to be yourself, but not too much yourself. You're supposed to grow, but not in ways that make you unrecognizable. You're supposed to be satisfied, but not complacent. The contradictions piled up until you couldn't remember what you'd originally wanted from the whole enterprise. At one point, she said, "Sometimes I think the kindest thing David and I could do is admit that we've become friendly strangers who share a mortgage and a credit score, that we're cohabitants more than companions, that we're performing married couple for our parents and our friends, and maybe even for ourselves. But underneath all that performance, we barely know each other anymore." I didn't know what to say to that. It felt both devastating and completely reasonable. There was something almost peaceful in her delivery of it. Not resignation exactly, but a kind of clear-eyed acceptance that felt like its own form of courage. "Do you think you'll leave him?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. Leaving feels so dramatic, so final. And for what? To prove I'm not a coward? To find some hypothetical version of happiness that might not even exist?" She shook her head. "Sometimes I think the real courage is in staying, in choosing to keep trying even when you're tired, even when you're not sure why you're trying anymore." We parted ways around 3. She had a dentist appointment. I had nowhere to be, but I said I did anyway, because the conversation had left me feeling raw and exposed, like I'd accidentally revealed more than I'd intended, just by listening. That night, Marcus was already home when I got there. He'd changed out of his work clothes into the soft gray t-shirt that had been through the wash so many times it was nearly translucent at the seams. He was making tea, which was unusual. He usually went straight for bourbon on Fridays. A ritual of decompression, he called it. The week's stress dissolved in 2 fingers of Maker's Mark. "Long week?" I asked, setting my bag on the counter. My keys made their usual sound against the granite, a small chime that marked the transition from outside world to home. "Yeah." He handed me a cup, keeping one for himself. Steam rose between us. "I've been thinking about something." My pulse quickened in a way I didn't want to examine. "What's that?" He leaned against the counter, holding his mug with both hands in that careful way people do when they need something to anchor them. "About us. About how we've gotten so good at being married that we've stopped actually being together. Like we're performing it instead of living it. Like we've memorized our parts." The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the hum of the refrigerator louder. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and careful. The clock ticked. Outside, someone's car alarm went off briefly, then stopped. "Where is this coming from?" I asked, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears. Higher, tighter. "I don't know, just something I've been thinking about." He took a sip of tea, looking at me over the rim. His eyes were dark, earnest. "Does that make sense to you?" It did. Of course it did. Claire had said almost the exact same thing 6 hours earlier, sitting at our table in the cafe, tearing her napkin into confetti. The phrases weren't identical. That's what I kept telling myself. Performing marriage and performing it were similar but not the same. Memorized our parts could be something anyone might say. Theater metaphors were common. Everyone understood the concept of going through motions, of executing routines without feeling. But it was the combination of phrases, the specific architecture of the thought that made my stomach drop. It was like hearing a song you knew by heart played in a different key, recognizable but wrong. "Yeah," I said slowly. "It makes sense." He nodded, seeming satisfied, and the conversation moved on to whether we should order Indian or Thai for dinner. We settled on Thai. We ate it on the couch watching something forgettable on Netflix. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. Except I couldn't stop thinking about his words, about Claire's words, about the space between them, which was smaller than it should have been. I started paying attention differently after that. Not intentionally at first. Or maybe that's a lie we tell ourselves when we don't want to admit we're looking for proof of something we already suspect. I noticed how Marcus would ask certain questions on Friday evenings, sometimes Saturday mornings, open-ended things about feelings, about the nature of relationships, about the difference between contentment and happiness, questions that felt both genuine and prepared, like he'd been rehearsing them. "Do you ever feel invisible?" he asked one Saturday while we were both in the kitchen, him making eggs, me unloading the dishwasher. "Like you're going through life and people see you, but they don't really see you?" I set down a plate carefully. "What do you mean?" "I mean, like, you're there, you're present, you're participating in your life, but you're not really seen for who you actually are. You're just this collection of roles and responsibilities that people interact with, but the actual person underneath all that is invisible." It was a Tuesday when I'd told Claire about feeling invisible in my own life, about how sometimes I'd watch Marcus read or work and realize he hadn't really looked at me. Not at me specifically, but at the person I actually was in months, maybe years, that he saw wife and Sarah, but not the complicated, shifting interior landscape of who I'd become. And Claire had said, understanding completely, it's like you're there but not there, present but not seen. Now here was Marcus, 2 weeks later, using almost the same formulation, present but not seen, there but not there. The words rearranged, but the meaning identical. Then he'd listen to my answers with the kind of focus he usually reserved for work calls, for client presentations, for things that mattered in quantifiable ways. He'd nod. He'd ask follow-up questions. He'd seem genuinely invested in understanding my inner life in a way he hadn't been in years. And days later, sometimes a week later, those same thoughts would resurface in his own words, polished smooth, offered back to me as insights he'd arrived at independently. When I'd told Claire about feeling like our marriage had become more about maintenance than meaning, changing filters and paying bills and coordinating schedules, but never actually connecting, she'd said, "It's like your roommates who occasionally have sex, business partners with benefits." 3 weeks later, Marcus said, during one of our increasingly frequent evening conversations about the state of our marriage, "Sometimes I worry we've become more like business partners than actual partners. Like we're running a household together, but we've forgotten we're supposed to be running a life together." I set down my wine glass very carefully. My hand was shaking slightly, and I didn't want him to see. "That's an interesting way to put it," I said, my voice measured. "Is it?" He seemed genuinely uncertain, his head tilted slightly in that way he had when he was trying to read me. "I thought it was just obvious. Isn't that how it feels? How do you ask your husband if he's taking your words from another woman? How do you accuse someone of stealing your own feelings? Secondhand." The question felt impossible to form without sounding insane, paranoid, like I was seeing conspiracies where there were only coincidences. "Yeah," I said instead. "That's how it feels." But it wasn't just the words anymore, it was the timing. Always on Friday evenings or weekends, after I'd had my lunch with Claire, always phrased as questions first, as if he was testing whether the language would work on me. And always delivered with this particular kind of earnestness that felt both genuine and performed. I started keeping track. Not on paper, that would have made it too real, too calculated, would have forced me to admit I was building a case against my own husband. But mentally, I cataloged the parallels. Claire's observation that marriage is just two people constantly negotiating who they used to be with, who they're becoming, appeared 3 days later as Marcus's reflection that maybe we're both just negotiating between our past selves and our future ones. When Claire admitted she sometimes fantasized about her life if she'd never married David, not with anyone specific in mind, but just the abstract freedom of it, the ability to make decisions that affected only herself, to travel without coordinating, to fail without disappointing anyone else, Marcus asked me a week afterward if I ever imagined what my life might have looked like if I'd made different choices. Not regretting anything, he added quickly, just wondering about the versions of ourselves we never became. The phrases were never identical. He was too smart for that, or maybe too intuitive. He'd change a word here, restructure a sentence there, swap a metaphor for a slightly different one. But the thoughts, the specific emotional architecture of them, were unmistakably Claire's, and unmistakably mine, given to her first, in the safety of Friday afternoons when I thought my words belonged to me alone. By November, the weather had turned properly cold, the kind of cold that makes you walk faster, that makes the cafe feel like a sanctuary when you step inside from the wind. Claire and I still met on Fridays, but something had shifted in me. I found myself censoring, holding back, choosing my words more carefully. Not because I didn't trust her. She hadn't done anything wrong, wasn't complicit in whatever was happening, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing I said was truly private anymore. That my words had become currency in some economy I didn't understand, being traded and exchanged in ways I couldn't track. I started testing it. It felt manipulative, like I was setting a trap for my own husband, but I needed to know if I was imagining things or finally seeing them clearly. During one Friday lunch, I invented a metaphor about marriage being like a house where you keep closing off rooms you can't afford to heat. It wasn't particularly profound, but it was specific. I elaborated. Said that at first you just close off the guest room, then the formal dining room you never use, then the den, until eventually you're living in just the kitchen and bedroom, telling yourself it's more efficient this way, more manageable, when really you've just made your world smaller and smaller. Claire liked it. She turned it over in conversation, added her own flourishes. "And then one day you realize you're living in a closet," she said, "and calling it cozy." That weekend, Marcus said, unprompted, while we were both reading in bed, "I read something interesting about relationships, about how they're like houses where you gradually close off rooms, supposedly to save energy, but really you're just making your world smaller. You start with this whole house of possibility and connection, and you end up living in just a couple of rooms, telling yourself it's enough." "Where did you read that?" I asked, my throat tight, my book forgotten in my lap. He paused, just briefly, long enough that I could see him searching for an answer. "I don't remember. Some article online, maybe Psychology Today or something." The lie was so naked I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Huh," I said, and went back to my book. But I didn't read another word. I just stared at the page until he turned off his light and rolled over. And then I lay there in the dark, trying to understand what was happening. The obvious question was how. I didn't think Marcus and Claire even knew each other, beyond the handful of times we'd all been at the same party or dinner, maybe 4 occasions in 3 years. All of them group settings where they'd barely exchanged more than pleasantries. They weren't friends. They didn't run in the same circles. They didn't have each other's phone numbers, as far as I knew. But then I remembered, probably a year ago, maybe more, Claire, mentioning in passing that David had started training at the same gym as Marcus. Something about David wanting to take CrossFit more seriously, and someone at his office recommending the gym where Marcus worked out. It had seemed unremarkable at the time. Men went to gyms. Sometimes they ended up at the same one. And hadn't Marcus mentioned, just in passing, maybe 6 or 7 months ago, that he'd gotten drinks a few times with David after workouts? That guy David, he'd said. Your friend Claire's husband. He's pretty cool. We grabbed beers at that place near the gym. I'd barely registered it. Had probably said something like, "That's nice," and gone back to whatever I was doing. Now the timing aligned with sickening clarity. Marcus's sudden interest in our marriage, his probing questions, his borrowed insights, all of it had started around then. Around the same time, he and David had become gym friends. I checked Marcus's phone once while he was in the shower. I'm not proud of it. I'd never done it before in 8 years of marriage, but I stood there in our bedroom, listening to the water run, and I went through his messages. I didn't find what I was looking for, which somehow made everything worse. No messages from Claire. Nothing from David about Claire. Just the ordinary debris of a person's digital life. Work emails, texts about meeting times and grocery lists, a thread with his brother about their fantasy football league, which meant either I was completely wrong, paranoid, constructing elaborate theories from coincidence, or they were careful, or they talked in person at the gym over those beers, nowhere that would leave a digital trail. Later, weeks later, I'd understand that I was looking for the wrong kind of evidence. I wanted proof of an affair, something concrete, something I could point to and say, there, that's the betrayal. Screenshots and receipts and the kind of smoking gun that makes everything clear. But the violation was subtler than that. It was in the questions Marcus must have been asking David about Claire's conversations with me, the way he must have been mining David for details about Claire's marriage, her unhappiness, her particular vocabulary of disappointment. What does Claire say about her marriage? How does she describe it? What words does she use? Or maybe David was doing the same with Claire about me. Maybe it went both ways, each man learning about his own wife through the other man's reports. A strange, secondhand intimacy built on borrowed insights and recycled confessions, each of them trying to understand the women they'd married by hearing how we talked about them when they weren't there. The thought made me feel scraped hollow, violated in a way I didn't have language for. It wasn't infidelity in any traditional sense, but it was a betrayal nonetheless. A theft of something I hadn't known could be stolen. December brought early darkness and the kind of cold that made everything contract. The days were short and brutal. The sun set before 5. Claire and I still met on Fridays, but I was different now. Careful, guarded. I found myself having 2 conversations, the one I was actually having with her, and the one I was imagining Marcus and David having about it later. I started saying things that were technically true, but emotionally empty. Things are fine. Marcus and I are good. Just busy with work. Safe statements that revealed nothing. Observations about the weather, about politics, about anything that wasn't the interior landscape of my marriage. Claire noticed, of course. Claire always noticed. "You're quiet lately," she said one afternoon in mid-December, hands wrapped around her coffee cup for warmth. The cafe had hung Christmas lights, and they cast everything in a soft, festive glow that felt disconnected from the actual mood at our table. "Is everything okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "Just tired." It wasn't untrue. I was exhausted in a way that sleep didn't touch. The mental effort of tracking conversations, of measuring each phrase Marcus used against the catalog in my mind, of wondering whether I was imagining patterns or finally seeing them clearly. It had worn grooves into my consciousness. I was tired from not sleeping, from lying awake listening to Marcus breathe, from trying to figure out if the man next to me was someone I could trust. "How are things with Marcus?" she asked, and there was something in her voice, concern, maybe, or curiosity, something that made me wonder if David had said something to her, if she knew what I suspected. I almost laughed. Fine, good, actually. We've been talking more. That's good. She smiled, and it was genuine. Talking is good. I nodded. I didn't tell her that every conversation I had with my husband now felt like performance art, that I'd started saying things just to see if they'd echo back to me later, transformed into his revelations, that I'd lost the ability to tell the difference between genuine connection and elaborate ventriloquism. We finished our coffee. We hugged goodbye on the sidewalk, the cold wind cutting between us. She said we should do this again next week, same time, same place. I said yes, even though I was already planning to cancel. The following week, I told Claire I was feeling sick and canceled our Friday lunch. My head was killing me, I texted. Rain check? She responded immediately. Feel better. Keep me posted. And the week after that, I said I had a work deadline. And the one after that, a dentist appointment that ran long. And then it was the holidays, and it was easy to let the tradition lapse, to claim busyness, to promise we'd reconnect in the new year. By January, we'd stopped meeting altogether. She texted a few times. I responded, but vaguely. Eventually, she stopped asking. The silence between us grew until it felt permanent, and I mourned the loss of the friendship, even as I was the one who'd killed it. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't planned. It was a Tuesday night in early February, the kind of night where winter feels endless, where spring seems like something you imagined rather than something that will actually arrive. Marcus was late coming home from the gym, or from wherever he actually went. I'd made dinner, let it get cold, scraped it into Tupperware containers with more force than necessary. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine when he walked in, cheeks red from the cold, carrying that particular brightness people have when they've just been seen by someone new, when they've just been reminded they're interesting. Sorry I'm late, he said, kissing the top of my head in that automatic way that had long ago replaced actual affection. Lost track of time. Were you with David? He stopped, hand still on my shoulder. I could feel his fingers tense slightly. Yeah, we grabbed food after. Why? Do you talk about me? The pause was long enough to be an answer. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Outside a siren passed, fading into the distance. What do you mean? When you're with David, do you talk about me? About our marriage? About what I tell Claire? He moved away, setting down his gym bag with careful precision. Sometimes. I mean, he's a friend. We talk about life. Why? I took a long sip of wine. My hands were steady, which surprised me. Because I know where you're getting your words. What are you talking about? The things you've been saying to me about our marriage, about feeling unseen, about performing instead of living, about rooms closing off, about being business partners instead of life partners. I looked up at him. Those are Claire's words, my words to Claire. And you've been using them like they're your own insights, like you thought of them yourself. His face did something complicated. Surprise, guilt, defensiveness, all flickering past too quickly to isolate. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted away, then back. That's insane. Is it? Yes. Jesus, Sarah. People say similar things about relationships all the time. That doesn't mean... When did you and David start comparing notes about your wives? When did you start asking him what Claire tells him about what I say to her? When did my Friday afternoon coffee dates become research material for your weekend conversations with me? The question landed like something physical. He actually flinched, his whole body reacting before he could control it. It's not like that, he said quietly. Then what is it like? Explain it to me, Marcus, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been stealing my words, my feelings, the things I trusted to a friend because I couldn't say them to you. And you took them and tried them on like they were clothes, like you could just wear my honesty instead of finding your own. He pulled out a chair, sat down across from me with a heaviness that suggested he'd been carrying something for a while. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed its endless note. Outside, a a car passed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the wall behind him, illuminating his face before plunging it back into shadow. David was frustrated, he finally said, his voice low and careful. About Claire, about their marriage. He said she spent all this time talking to you about how unhappy she was, but she never said any of it to him. She'd come home from your coffee dates and be distant, quiet. like she'd used up all her words on you and had none left for him. So he started asking me if you said similar things, if you felt the same way she did. And you told him, "No, I—" He stopped, ran a hand through his hair, leaving it standing at odd angles. "I asked you instead. I couldn't ask you directly. Hey, do you tell Claire you're unhappy with me?" That would have been, but I could use what he told me about Claire, about how she described her marriage, about what she wanted, and I could see if those same things resonated with you. You spied on me using my best friend. That's not what it was. Then what was it, Marcus? What do you call it when you take someone's private conversations and use them to manipulate them? He looked stricken. Manipulate? I was trying to connect with you. I was trying to understand you. You never tell me how you really feel. You never just say, "Marcus, I'm unhappy," or "Marcus, I need something different." You keep everything locked up inside, and the only way I know what's actually going on with you is through Claire, filtered through David, filtered through me. It was trying to speak your language instead of mine. The honesty of it was somehow worse than any lie could have been, because I understood it. I understood the loneliness that would drive someone to steal someone else's words rather than admit they'd lost their own. I understood the desperation of loving someone you couldn't reach, of sharing a life with someone whose interior landscape was increasingly foreign. You took my words, I said, and my voice cracked despite my best efforts to keep it steady. You took my feelings, the things I trusted to a friend, because they felt too vulnerable to say out loud to you, and you tried them on like they were clothes, like you could just wear my honesty instead of finding your own. Do you understand how that feels? To have your own words handed back to you as someone else's insight? I know. His voice was barely above a whisper. I know. I'm sorry. I didn't know how else to reach you. We sat there in the cold kitchen, the dinner I'd made congealing in containers on the counter, and I realized that I'd been wrong about what betrayal looked like. It wasn't always another person, another body, another bed. Sometimes it was this: someone you loved standing in the doorway between your words and your silence, stealing the language you'd built to explain your own loneliness because they couldn't build their own. Does David do the same thing? I asked after a long silence. Does he use my words with Claire? Does he take what you tell him I say and try to connect with her through my language? Marcus looked at his hands. His wedding ring caught the light from the fixture above us, a ring I'd chosen, that I'd slipped onto his finger 8 years ago in front of everyone we loved. I don't know, probably. We never really discussed that part. But yeah, I assume so. We were all just echoes of each other, I thought. 4 people in 2 marriages, none of us brave enough to speak directly, all of us borrowing each other's courage like it was something that could be lent and returned without losing value in the transaction. I don't know how to talk to you anymore, I said. The admission felt like defeat and relief in equal measure. I know, me neither, and that was the truth of it. We'd been fluent in each other once, Marcus and I, when we were dating, when we were newly married. There had been an ease to our communication that felt effortless. We could finish each other's sentences. We could read each other's moods from across a room. Now we needed translators. Now we couldn't get from feeling to expression without going through David and Claire first, without testing our words on other people before we trusted them to each other. What do we do now? He asked. I didn't have an answer. I wanted to say we try again. We start over. We learn to talk to each other with our own words. But I didn't know if that was possible. I didn't know if you could rebuild trust after this particular kind of violation, after someone had stolen not your body, but your voice. I don't know, I said. We sat in silence for a long time after that. Eventually, Marcus got up and put the leftover food in the refrigerator. I washed my wine glass and set it in the drainer. We moved around the kitchen like strangers sharing a space, careful not to touch, not to meet eyes, not to risk any contact that might require genuine connection. That night, he slept in the guest room. Neither of us suggested otherwise. Nothing dramatic happened after that night. That's what no one tells you about these kinds of fractures, how quiet they are. How life just continues, slightly rearranged, all the same objects in slightly different positions. The house still looked the same, the clock still blinked 12 awake, the refrigerator still hummed, Marcus's jacket still hung on the same hook, though some nights it didn't because he was working late, or staying at his brother's, or just driving around because being home felt too complicated. I didn't call Claire right away. I needed time to think, to process, to figure out how I felt about what had happened. When I finally did, weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon when the silence in the house had become unbearable, she already knew. "David told me," she said, before I could even get the words out. About the conversations with Marcus, about how they'd been comparing notes, about... She trailed off. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I didn't know. I never would have. I thought what we talked about was just between us." "It's not your fault," I said, and I meant it. "You didn't do anything wrong." "Neither did you." We were both quiet for a while. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, could picture her in her house, maybe in her kitchen, standing by the window like I was. "David and I are in therapy now," she said finally, "trying to figure out how to actually talk to each other instead of using our friends as translators. It's hard. I can imagine." "Are you and Marcus?" "I don't know yet," I said, which was the most honest answer I had. "We're existing in the same space. I don't know if that's enough." "I miss you," she said, her voice small. "I miss our Fridays." "I miss them too." But we didn't make plans to meet, not then, not yet. Maybe eventually we would find our way back to that corner table, to that particular quality of afternoon light, to the easy honesty we'd once shared. But right now, that space felt contaminated, unsafe. Every word I'd ever said there now felt potentially weaponized, potentially someone else's tool. Some rooms you have to lock before you can figure out what they were for. Marcus and I still live in the same house. We're still married, technically, though I'm not sure what that means anymore, beyond the legal and logistical entanglements. He sleeps in the guest room some nights, the bedroom others. There's no pattern to it, no clear logic. We're both just trying to figure out how to exist in the space between leaving and staying. We tried therapy for a while, sat on a beige couch in a beige office and talked to a woman with kind eyes, and careful questions about trust and communication and the foundations of relationship. It helped maybe. Or at least it gave us vocabulary that was ours, not borrowed from Claire and David. But it also felt like another kind of performance, like we were learning lines written by someone else, following a script for couple in crisis working toward reconciliation. He stopped asking me questions about my feelings. I think he's afraid of what he might do with the answers, where they might travel, whose mouth they might eventually come out of. And I've stopped expecting him to intuitively understand me. Maybe that's growth. Maybe it's just defeat. Maybe there's no difference. The strange thing is, I don't hate him. I probably should. Some of my friends, the ones I've told, carefully edited versions, think I should. They use words like gaslighting and emotional manipulation and toxic. And maybe they're right. Maybe those words apply here, but when I see him in the kitchen in the morning, making coffee in that careful way he has, measuring the grounds precisely, heating the water to exactly the right temperature, I mostly just feel sad. Sad for both of us, for how desperate we'd become to understand each other, that we'd resorted to theft. Sad that we couldn't just say what we needed to say directly, that we needed David and Claire as intermediaries, as translators, as unwitting accomplices in our failure to communicate. Sad for Claire and David, probably doing their own version of this grief in their own quiet house, probably sitting at their own kitchen table, wondering how it all went so wrong. Sometimes I wonder if Marcus has any words of his own left, or if everything he knows how to feel now came from somewhere else, borrowed and repurposed until the original meaning wore away. Sometimes I wonder the same thing about myself. If I'm still capable of authentic expression, or if I've been performing for so long that I've forgotten what it feels like to just speak without calculation. We have good days sometimes, days when we can sit together and talk about something neutral, a podcast we both listen to, a news story, plans for repainting the bathroom. Days when the weight of what happened doesn't sit quite so heavily between us. Days when I can almost imagine a future where we rebuild this, where we learn each other's language again, where trust becomes possible. But those days are rare. Most days we just move through our routines. He goes to work, I go to work. We come home to the same house, eat dinner at the same table, sleep in different rooms, or the same room, depending on some calculus neither of us has articulated. We're polite. We're functional. We're two people sharing space and history and maybe still love, but definitely not trust. Not yet. Maybe not ever. It's Friday again. I'm home, making tea, watching the afternoon light move across the kitchen counter. The angle is different now than it was in October when this all started, the sun taking a different path across the sky, marking the slow turn toward spring. The clock still blinks 12 o'clock. The refrigerator still hums its familiar note. Outside, someone's dog is barking. The neighbors are arguing about something, their voices carrying through the walls. I'm supposed to meet Claire today. We'd texted earlier this week, tentative and careful, and decided to try again. Same cafe, different table. We both agreed we needed a fresh start, a way to reclaim something that had been taken from us. I don't know what we'll talk about. I don't know if I can be honest with her anymore, or if honesty is something I've lost the ability to access. I don't know if our friendship can survive this if it's already dead and we're just too attached to the memory of it to admit it. But I'm gonna go. Because the alternative is staying here in this house, in this kitchen, with these same sounds and this same light, waiting for something to change that probably never will. I don't know what I believe anymore about love, about marriage, about the possibility of truly knowing another person. But I know this. Words are not neutral. They're not just vessels we pour meaning into and expect to come out unchanged. They're evidence of who we are when no one's watching. They're the architecture of our inner lives. They're how we build trust and intimacy and understanding. And when someone takes them, even with good intentions, even out of love, even out of desperate loneliness, they're taking something that can't fully be returned. You can give back the words, but you can't give back the safety they were spoken in. You can apologize for the theft, but you can't restore the trust that was broken in the taking. Marcus came home last night and asked if I wanted to talk. Really talk, he said. With our own words this time, with no filters, no intermediaries, no borrowed language. Just us, trying to find each other again in the rubble of what we'd built. I told him I'd think about it. Maybe that's where we start. Not with borrowed insights or stolen metaphors, but with the messy, inarticulate truth of two people who forgot how to speak to each other without a script. Maybe we learn our own language again, slowly, awkwardly, like children grasping for words they don't quite have yet. Maybe we stumble through the grammar of genuine connection, making mistakes, correcting them, trying again. Or maybe we don't. Maybe some silences are permanent. Maybe some distances can't be crossed. Maybe the kindest thing two people can do is admit that they've become friendly strangers who share a mortgage and stop pretending otherwise. I'm still deciding which would be crueler, to stay and rebuild with new words, knowing they might never feel as safe as the old ones, or to leave and take my words with me, guard them more carefully next time, trust them only to myself. But I left the door unlocked when I left this morning. I didn't tell Marcus I was meeting Claire, but I didn't hide it either. The calendar on the fridge just says coffee, 2 p.m., and he'll see it or he won't. He'll understand or he won't. He'll worry or he'll be relieved. For now, that's enough. The door unlocked, the possibility of return, the hope that maybe, someday, we'll find our way back to honesty. Not the borrowed kind, but the real kind, the kind that hurts and heals in equal measure. The kind that sounds like truth spoken after too long in the dark.